Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thank you for joining me for the podcast where our personal stories remind us how much we can learn from each other. In this episode, grief educator Lisa Rites talks about the losses we don't always name, the damage caused by well-meaning advice, and why so many people feel like they're grieving the wrong kind of way. We explored divorce as grief, delayed grief, and the quiet ways loss shows up years later, often when we least expect it. So, Lisa, welcome to the show today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for being here. So, before I start asking you my list of questions, I want to give you a moment to tell the listeners about your book.
Sure. So, my book is basically my story through grief and divorce. And I actually, going through it, didn't realize how much divorce is grief. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. But it is a loss. And a lot of people always think of grief as death. But grief can be any kind of loss. And end of relationship is a huge loss for people. So I decided to write my story down, give information about grief and each of the stages. And then as they go through those stages, I talk about my story through that stage. And then I give readers a chance to journal some information, answer some questions for themselves, and hopefully at the end, find some inner peace and some answers to the way they're feeling.
Okay, and based on the topic of grief and
Mhm.
your last name, have you ever been called things like last rites or dead to rights?
That's really funny, but no, I always say that when people will say to me, "How do you spell your last name?" I'm like, "Rights, like last rights." Because that's the best way I can describe it. So yeah, you would think I'd hear more of that though, but
People just aren't creative enough, I guess.
no, just me.
All right, so can you share a story about how your personal experiences with grief and divorce led you to become a certified grief educator?
Yeah, so 40 years of my life, I was a registered respiratory therapist. So I dealt with families and grieving families, families that were just going towards near death with their loved ones. Unfortunately, with respiratory disease, a lot of times there's no better outcome. So as I was progressing out of my full time career, I wanted to continue to do something with my life and something that I could help with compassion and empathy. So I looked into this profession and moved myself over to be a certified grief educator, and went through the courses in the schooling, and now I work with clients that are going through grief. And not therapy, it's more education, truly education, walking side by side with somebody that is going through the grief process and trying to help them as they go through each of the stages.
So, do you work with like hospices, things like that?
Yes, but I mostly work with clients on my own, all virtual. And I've worked with veterans. I work with, obviously, end of relationship is one of my niches, and then a lot of times I work with a lot of caregivers that are family members that are living with the elderly or their parents that are near death. That I try to help those caregivers learn about the death process and the grieving process as they're getting ready to grieve their loved ones.
All right. So, what did you learn from being a respiratory therapist that helps you in your approach now?
Um, well, knowing as a respiratory therapist, and a lot of patients aren't told, especially when they have a lung disease such as COPD or emphysema, that there is no cure for that, and life can get very difficult towards the end. Your breathing process. So, I'm working with families and trying to help them through that. I used to run a COPD support group for families to help them through what they were facing, because a lot of times people again are just misinformed and don't have all the information, and change in diet or just change in activities that patients can do, and family members think they are family, their person who has a disease is able to do all the things they used to do, and they're not. And so working with that kind of helped me with this, because now again I can work with families and work with others that are going through that.
Okay. What was the moment you realized you wanted to dedicate your career to grief education and support?
I think because I'm a very compassionate person, I get a lot of that from my mother. Um, I just, I just love to help people. I was the person, I always tell people I'm the person that always brought the stray dogs home when I was growing up. I've always had that in me. I believe in people. I want the best for people. So I really, once I moved out of respiratory, I just really wanted to find something that I could be able to help people and just watch them grow. And it's just such a great feeling when you're helping somebody in grief, be able to move into another step, even if it's just being able to wake up in the morning and put your feet on the floor. That's a huge step for some people. And when I'm meeting with them and they're telling me that, and they're just like, "Oh, I was able to do this," and I went to a book club by myself because maybe their partner's gone now, or they were out to dinner or lunch by themselves. Just to see that makes me feel so good that I'm able to help somebody be able to just move on to another step, move
So was
forward,
there
I should say.
okay? Sorry to interrupt. Was there any particular loss or turning point that shifted your perspective on grief?
There really wasn't. It really just came from my heart, and it was just something that I wanted to do. I did lose my mom back in March, which I think what I know now was able to help me through more of that versus when my dad passed. And learning in the grief education course about all the different losses, because I didn't realize myself how many different types of losses there are, and learning about that whole relationship and divorce and going, aha, that's crazy. Like I went through all that, and yeah. So I just feel like I learned a lot more about grief myself, not knowing about all the different losses.
Okay, does your definition of grief differ from like the common cultural understanding?
I believe it does. I think culturally we are not educated. I feel like grief is one of those subjects that people just don't talk about. We don't learn about it. People are just told, a family member passed. This is the process we're going to do, and then okay, now you got to go back to work or school or, whatever you're wherever you're at the time, and basically that's it. We talk about our loved one here and there, but people just don't realize that there is a whole process to go through. And for some people, it can last a lifetime. For some people, it might just be through the process and they're good. But I just feel society does not know how to deal or talk to people that might be in grief. Um, I think a lot of times, one of the things that I do when I'm working with clients that are facing a grief that's coming towards them, such as the death of a family member, a loved one. One of the things, I tell them is about how that person's going to change, and maybe that person doesn't want to die, and they just don't know how to tell you that. And a lot of times people get frustrated with the elderly because, they're not behaving the same way. And maybe inside the person is really frustrated because they're watching their loved one pass, and that can be very difficult. And that is all process of grief. And I think people don't realize that. Another thing is friends helping friends. I deal a lot with this. People don't know what to say to people who are grieving other than I'm sorry, because that's what we say, right? That's what we're taught. You say you're sorry and you move on. But things not to say are things like, you should be over it by now, or wow, you talk about this person too much, or, you should be past that. And those are definitely not things to say. I always try to tell people maybe an idea is if somebody is grieving, you don't know what to say, call them up and maybe have them over and have a cup of coffee and just sit there and let them talk. And if they're still grieving, it's okay. They're allowed to. Try not to stop them, tell them that they shouldn't be talking about their loved one, because it's perfectly fine to do that. But I feel in society we don't have the patience for people that are in grief, and that's just sad.
It is sad, and one thing I've learned, having lost both of my parents when I was pretty young, especially my dad when I was 13 years old. Uh, Over the Christmas break, my now adult son, who lives in Virginia and I live in Texas, he's
Hmm.
been married about a year and a half, and he and his wife came down for the holidays, and we drove to Houston to the cemetery where my parents are buried.
Mm-hmm.
And it was sort of an opportunity in my mind to sort of introduce my parents to my daughter-in-law and
Mm-hmm.
my now adult son. And it was way more emotional than I anticipated it being.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it was because my son is so much like my dad. And me
Okay.
thinking about how much they would have enjoyed each other's company.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, when we do, we think about the things that our parents are missing or our loved ones are missing. I have the same thing. I've had some children get married since my dad passed, and um, he didn't get to see that. And I know he would have loved it. And I know he would love all my son in laws and, daughter in law and all that. But, he didn't get that opportunity. So, yeah, that's that. And again, that is still part of grief because it does come back up at you when you least expect it. And, and
Even
like you
after
said,
45 years.
right? But it tug at the heartstrings because you went there and it was a whole different experience for you. Where maybe if you visit him, you just go, you talk to him, and now here's where you wanted him to meet some people in your life that are important to you, and he would have loved. So your whole attitude changes, and it's a whole different outlook. I used to go
Absolutely.
to the cemeteries sometimes, like to see aunts or uncles, and just do the thing that I was told I was supposed to do. And then I would see people, I would see like a young family sitting on Father's Day at the grave in
Wow.
beach chairs. And I'm like, what are those people doing? Like, that's crazy. I just couldn't understand it. But you know what? Since I've been doing this now, and I'm getting that. Like I said, my mom passed in March, and Christmas Eve, my husband and I drove out to the cemetery, and I'm sorry, on Thanksgiving, we drove out to the cemetery, and we brought some coffee because my mom loved to have morning coffee. So we went and we had a cup of coffee with my mom, and I talked to her and my dad, and I took some pictures and sent them to my kids, things I never thought I would do, but it stirred up a whole different feeling inside. And I realized that's okay. You're allowed to do this. That person was a part of your life for a really long time. We don't have to forget them. And a lot of people feel they have to move on in grief. You just need to move forward.
That's a great distinction. So we talked about death, and you mentioned
Mhm.
divorce as reasons to grieve, but also life transitions.
Mhm.
How are these experiences similar, and how are they different?
So life experiences is a great form of grief, and I think people don't realize again that they're in grief when major things happen, such as loss of a job, loss of a family home. Maybe you're moving to another place and you're going to lose all your friends. People don't understand what that feeling is, and that is a feeling of grief because it's a loss. For some of the veterans that I work with, it's a loss of a limb. It could be loss of themselves being in the service. So really, any type of loss, people can grieve. Grief doesn't just have to be a death. So we're trying to educate more on the word grieve because that word does pertain to a lot of things in life, and for a lot of people it's going to be your new normal. If you're moving, let's just say, like you said, I moved from New Jersey to Delaware. I remember the day I moved out of my house and everybody left. We had unpacked, and I stood in my kitchen that I had raised my family in. This was after my divorce, and I just cried. Didn't understand why. I was sad. I was just so sad, but that's grief. It is. It's grief. I'm losing. I lost my house, my family home where I was raising my children. I would move to another place, and I'm remarried. And I'm not saying life isn't good on this side. It is. But for that moment, I needed to grieve, and I needed to let go of what what that was for me. And now I needed to move on to what my new normal was going to look like. You know, I always tell people too, you can hold joy in one hand and grief in the other. And that's what I try to, when I'm working with my clients, I try to get them to that part where they're still holding that grief, which is fine because you're still want to remember some of the things you had, but you can have joy and you can move on and you can still have life. Your life is just going to look a little different.
All right. So, in your view, why is an individualized support so important for the grief journey?
I do believe to have someone who understands the grief journey, like we were just talking about with education and trying to maybe talk to your friends or people who just don't understand. And I'm not saying you have to be in therapy or you have to, go to see doctors or whatever, but I think just having somebody to support you and help educate you along the way and let you know that your feelings are valid, what you're feeling is fine, and how do we move to that next step? How do you want to move to that next step? It's not about me telling them, oh, this is what you have to do next, or this is what you have to do. It's not, because you need to make your own decisions. And as you move forward, you need to figure out what you want your next steps to be. Like I said, whether it be getting out of bed in the morning because you haven't been able to do that for a really long time, or maybe it's learning how to make some new friends. Maybe it's learning how to rediscover yourself. That was huge for me after my divorce, was finding myself again, because I didn't become a bad person. I became a different person because I was raising 4 children. I became a mom. All those things that were Lisa when she was single, not with a family, had gone away. So when I went through my divorce and I was moving on through my grief process, and I moved into that acceptance stage and trying to find myself again, I brought back some of the old me, so it's real important to dig down deep and find some of that, and just be able to walk with somebody and have somebody that will listen to you more as I always like to say, as a friend than as a medical personnel.
Okay, so what are some of the early signs that someone might benefit from some professional grief support?
So usually right away after a death, I usually won't take on a new client because people are in early grief, and I think it's too early to move into some of those stages. And I usually like to tell people when I meet with them, reach out to me in about 6 months. Let's see where you're at, so that they have some time to have that personal grief and get all of that off of them, and then kind of start to look into, especially if you find you're not moving on. I've had clients call me and they're just like, I cry every day. I can't stop crying. I just cry every day. And it's been a year. Okay. And then you start from right there. Why, what are you crying about? And then moving on and trying to help them through so that they're not crying every day. And, trying to realize things we can do, and worksheets and journaling and things like that kind of help you get through those phases. So I don't work with early grief, but I will tell people to just try to process a little bit and then reach out to me. And a lot of people will wait, and then once they wait, and a lot of people will call me right before that first anniversary is coming up, because they have to get through that part, and that's a tough part, and that's when I think sometimes people start to need help.
So what does a first session look like with you?
So I offer a free session first, where we talk. I like to hear who their loss was, or what their loss was. Talk about it a little bit. See where they are in the grief process. Some people could be 10 years in. Some people could be a year in, and then just try to see if we're both a good fit. And then I usually tell people, think about it, decide if this is something that you want, and then they can go back and book sessions if they want to. And then I usually start with that client wherever they are in their grief process. It could be anger, it could be trying to learn acceptance. So everybody's in different places of the grief process. And then we kind of go from there. So I, never tell people just sign on. I always like to, make sure that they're thinking about it and if this is something that they want to do or talk about.
So if somebody's in the midst of grief, what are the
Mm-hmm.
first things you encourage them to prioritize?
Usually the first thing we talk about is journaling. Journaling is a big relief process. And if they haven't been journaling, I usually always have my clients start. That's the first week. We'll always start with journaling, and writing things down, whether it's anger. It depends, again, where they are and what kind of journaling we'd be doing. And then always providing worksheets and moving on and, just talking through wherever stages that they're at. But journaling is huge. And when you look at my website or you look at my monthly newsletters, they're always talking about journaling because it's just such a good way for people to get and release whatever it is they're thinking or feeling.
All right. So, how can somebody best support someone they know and who's in the grieving process without overstepping their boundaries or saying the wrong things?
Right. So like I said, some of the wrong things that you could say, don't say those. But I always tell people supporting a friend or a loved one. First off, maybe have them over for coffee, maybe bring them lunch, maybe ask if they want to go for a walk and let them say whatever they want to say. Just listen. Don't answer back saying, "Oh, I had that with my father," and then start rambling about yours. There'll be a chance for you to say yours too, but try to just let that conversation roll and let that person speak to you and just say whatever it is they're feeling. And if they want to talk about their loved one for 20 minutes, that's okay. Let them, just shake your head and say, yeah, oh, or I remember that, or that was so funny about that person, but saying, well, you'll get better, or you're going to get over this, or, they will, but they might not right away. And it's not what they want to hear because they're going to walk away saying, okay, great. That didn't help me. So just kind of being empathetic and really listening to what the person's saying and just support whatever it is that they're telling you.
Yeah, obviously, different people express grief in different kinds of ways, but there's also different stages of grief within that one person too. So you can
Correct.
have like moments of sorrow and moments of joy. So how do you help people
Right.
understand that kind of complexity?
So I will talk about the different stages in the beginning. And I always tell people it's like a ladder. And as you move through the stages, because the stages don't have to happen in order, but as you're moving through, I always talk about anger because anger is probably the biggest and the hardest stage to get past because whatever your loss is, there is usually anger that comes with it. So I always tell people, you may start feeling better and you're working your way up that ladder and you're getting towards, feeling a little bit better. And then you're going to have a really bad day and you're going to fall back down and you're going to get really angry and you're going to get really mad, and again, it's okay, but what are you going to do if that happens? Or try to find out what their triggers are that upset them and how are we going to deal with those triggers? And the next time the trigger comes, what are we going to do to get past that trigger so that you don't fall back into a stage and stay there because you never want to get stuck. I always tell people try not to get stuck in grief. You want to moving forward is really the goal that we work with is to just get you forward and get you past wherever you're at. We don't want you to stay stuck.
What are some coping mechanisms that people can use to help them get past a stuck stage?
Past the stuck stage. So yeah, I mean, you really have to you have to think about what your trigger might be that is making you stay there. So let me just take like for my divorce when I was stuck in that anger stage for a really really long time because my husband left me, so I was really angry, and the trigger was the person he was with. Anytime I saw her or my kids came home and spoke of her, I got really angry, so I would journal and then I would crumple it all up and throw it across the room because that would make me feel better. Sometimes I would grab a game and play with my kids, or I would say, hey, let's go for a walk. Let's go for a bike ride. Just something to move and get me past that thing. I always tell people, a lot of people will say, well, I'm going to have a bottle or I'm going to take this, or, we try to push away from, because alcohol is not the answer. Medication is not always the answer, and for that, you don't need me. And I would push you towards who you would need. But yeah, I try to, whatever it is or wherever they are, if they have children or if it's, if they're by themselves, or they have a dog, take your dog, go for a walk, hug your dog, grab your dog, go, what is it you like to eat? Make yourself something special, just something to get away from that trigger, so that you don't keep staying stuck and falling back. And if you're stuck, I can't go out, I don't want to do anything alone, then we'll talk about, okay, so maybe a friend, or how do you think you can, how about go to the library and get a book? That's like, you'll be out by yourself, or they'll make that step and they're excited. Or, I had a client that was going through a divorce and didn't want to do anything by herself. And she went to a museum that was having like a poetry talk. And she reached out to me the next week when we were in session, and she was like, oh my God, it was wonderful. And I did it by myself. And, I actually went up to somebody and said hello, and like, it was huge, So just, again, just giving them ideas, but depending where they are is going to depend on the thoughts or processes that I would go over with them to do.
Okay, so getting back to your book, just for a couple questions. So
Mm-hmm.
your book emphasizes grace, faith, and hope. So how do these
Mm-hmm.
elements play a role in healing from loss?
Always giving yourself grace. People need to be a little bit easier on themselves. So when I do talk about grace, and I talk about giving yourself some grace, and when you're having a rough day, it's okay. The next day, wake up, let yourself get past that. It's okay. You're allowed to do that. My faith was a big part for me. I believe in God, so a lot of my prayers and talking to God and having Him help me through, and going to church, because I did, after my divorce, after I separated, I jumped out of the church for a long time. And then when I met my now husband, him and I started going back to church weekly, and I found my faith again, and I realized that I really needed that. So, those are some of the things that helped me through.
So how do you support somebody who has lost their faith because of what they're dealing with grief?
That's very difficult to deal with. I usually try to find out what they believe in, or what they no longer are believing in, and I really just try to talk to them about why they lost what they lost, and try to promote that there is a higher power. But I have clients that just don't believe in that, won't go anywhere. So it just depends on the person that I'm talking to.
All right, so can grief ever be anything than just painful? Can it be transformative or causes somebody to have a kind of growth experience?
Absolutely. I think you can move forward from grief. Again, I think that grief, there will be times when that grief is there, maybe on an anniversary date, or maybe on that person's birthday, if we're dealing with death. With divorce, it depends how it ends. Now, my divorce ended very friendly. I was at my husband's wedding, my ex-husband's wedding last year. So we ended very friendly, but that was the path I chose, because I decided at one point, which is in my book, I no longer wanted to be angry, because why was I going to spend the rest of my time angry? He had moved on. He was doing his thing. My kids were doing their thing. And why am I going to be angry? That's crazy. So learning how to move forward. Are there times I still grieve? Yes. Do I still grieve the loss of my marriage? I certainly do. Even though I've moved on, because I sit some days and I wonder, like when my kids got married and we were both at the wedding, I'm like, how would this have been if we were married? Would this have looked any different? So I think that grief, some forms of it will never go away, but you can move on and be happy, and still hold that loss if you need to. It's perfectly fine. If you don't need to, you don't have to. You can let it go. But for those that are out there that need to hold on to it, it's perfectly fine. And don't let people tell you don't have to, because you can hold on to it as long as you want to.
Okay, so I just have a couple questions left to start to wind down the conversation. So
Sure.
let's talk about your book some more. It's called Grief and
Okay.
Divorce: a Journey Through Healing. So what kind of
Mhm.
impact do you hope the readers get from it?
I hope I do talk about the end. I hope they can get some inner peace. My goal with writing the book was because I feel like my family dynamic is not typical anymore, but I was able to move past all those stages and come to acceptance, and accept, in all honesty, I needed to accept for myself that part of that divorce was my fault. There is a reason he strayed. I'm sure I had something to do with that. So I had to accept that, which is a really difficult thing, but I always still try to accept all the good things I liked about him, all the things that made me happy when we were in the marriage. We have 4 children together, and I can't imagine being angry with him now in front of my children and not speaking. I feel like every family function would have looked horrific if it was that way. And I know there are a lot of people out there that have that. So I'm hoping if you read my story, you might get a little hope that if you do something, even one little thing in there, maybe something will trigger and you do it a little differently. Maybe you can be a little happier too and move on. If you can't have that dynamic, which not everybody can, I hope that somebody will find some inner peace and at least for themselves feel a little bit better that, okay, I struggled like she did throughout all those stages. I did all this, but when it came to that keeping the strong bonds together, I can't do that. But there was a lot of stuff that I had to come to realization for, because my first thoughts when my husband was leaving was, I'm never, ever going to let you see my children again. We had this family, you're leaving it, you're never seeing them. And he knew that. But as I started to realize, and I mentioned this in the book, that I did come to realize he was not leaving his family, he was leaving me. So I had to accept that. It was me, it wasn't his children. And by him having them or having time with them, it gave me free time. Oh, duh, gave me time to go do some things for myself, again, why make that strain on yourself, whether you're the male in the situation or the female, being selfish is not going to help anybody in this situation. So if at any part you can start to look forward and move on, even if you're just at the end of a relationship, maybe there are no children, maybe it's not even a divorce, but I know people who are in relationships that can't even date anymore. There is a way, and you can do this. You have to just learn and be educated on the ways to get through it, and you can get through it. I do believe that.
All right. So as a final question today, what's next for you? What do you have planned to do? Do you plan to write another book? What do you
I
have?
am, yeah. So I am, my next book, I am working on it now. I am calling on veterans that have stories of grief, be it any kind of grief story. I'm listening to them, and I'm going to be putting stories together. So I'm going to make a story of veteran stories. So that's what I'm working on now. And I just finished recording 2 courses, one on loss of your mother, one on loss of your father. And they relate to whether you had a good relationship with your mother or father, or a complicated one. So be it your mom died and she was loving, or if you had a relationship with your mom where maybe she was not the loving mom and you're grieving that part, because there's that also. So these 2 courses are aligned together. And that's in the works. That'll be coming out within the next month. And then I'll be working on, I'm going to be working on courses for grief and divorce, and I'm going to be working on some for grief in the workplace. So I have a lot coming up this year.
So can you tell the listeners how they can get in touch with you or how they can find out more about your work?
Yeah. So I'm on all social media, Lisa Rites Grief. And my website is lisaritesgrief.com. And you can go on there, and there's connections to all my social media. I have a monthly blog. You can sign up for my newsletter, and you can book a free session there. You can book sessions. There's information about my book, my ebooks. Everything is on there that you could need. So I always say start there.
Okay, I will include those links in the show notes.
Okay.
So our guest today has been grief educator Lisa Rites. Lisa, thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great.
So as Lisa reminds us, grief doesn't come with a finish line. Healing isn't about erasing your loss, but learning how to carry it with honesty and with grace. So please like and share this episode with someone who may be grieving now. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Until next time, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.